over the years, 100 years ago now, William Jennings Bryan said something like 4 words have been transmitted from Dayton about this trial than any other event in American history. And I've seen estimates that sound right of about 2 million words transmitted from Dayton over a period of about 2 weeks. There have probably been many times that number of words written in the past 100 years. Most of them, I would guess, focused on William Jennings Bryan, Clarence Darrow, the other luminaries that made this trial the event that it was. Not that much was written about John Scopes. You know, I think he said something like 74 words on the record during the trial. We don't call it the William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow trial, we call it the Scopes trial. And part of the thinking about this event is, let's find out something about John Scopes. Randy Moore has been a friend of Dayton and Rhea County, the Scopes trial for, well, he told me this is something like his 60th or 66th visit to Rhea County over the last 30 years. And, you know, it's terrible for some of us who live here to say he knows more about the place than we do. It's true. Randy just retired as professor of biology, and H.G. Morse Alumni Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, St. Paul. He has a list of accomplishments, publications. One that he seems particularly proud of, and I'm proud to recount this, is he's an honorary lifetime member of the Rhea County Historical Society. Randy has recently published a year and a half ago, the first biography of John Scopes. John Thomas Scopes biography. John Scopes did his memoirs, Center of the Storm, but he left a lot out. And Randy, we'd like you to come fill in some of those blanks for us.
Thank you, Tom. What an honor to be here. I've been coming here a long time. I've never been in this place. 100 years ago, there was a pastor here named Howard Bird. During the trial, he decided he was going to invite an evolutionary or someone who accepted evolution to come preach at a Sunday morning service. His congregation found out about this and revolted. They sent him a note, we're going to tear down, we're going to end the church. You can't go through with this. And Howard Bird relented. He was not allowed to resign and by creed of his church. So he just said, I quit. I hope you'll not revolt. I think I'm the second evolutionary biologist to ever be invited to speak here. Maybe Todd Wood. One of the few, I'll put. Anyway, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for that nice introduction. I have some people that I want to thank. Lots of my friends here go way back. Pat Guffey, Ralph Green, Tom Davis, and many more I can't start to name. Let me show you some pictures of other people that I owe a lot to. Many of you may recognize this man. This is Professor Richard Cornelius. He was a preacher. He was a professor at Bryan College. Many people like myself who became interested in the Scopes trial and visited Dayton, they started at Bryan College with Dick Cornelius. This is a woman who lived down Market Street, Eloise Reed. When my second visit here, Professor Cornelius took me to her house and she said, I want you to come back next time. The next time I came back, she asked me over and had made me a sandwich and chips. It became a regular stop until about a year before her death. I thank those two. I also have some people without whom I would not have much to tell you at all tonight. This is John Scopes Jr. We were just ordering some catfish in a restaurant near his home in Louisiana. This is Bill Scopes, John and Mildred Scopes' youngest son, at his home in Guntersville, Alabama. Here's a group of friends and relatives of John Scopes, starting from left to right. Some of you have met these people. This picture was taken in the Rhea County Courthouse in 2016. They were all here. Starting left to right, that is Jerry Tompkins, the late great Reverend Jerry Tompkins, a personal friend of John Scopes. I'll mention a book of his later. Next to him is Lisa Renegarb, a great-grandniece of John Scopes. Next to her is Susan Epperson. We're going to come across a court case that Susan Epperson led about laws banning the teaching of human evolution. Next to her is Nancy Rose, another grandniece of John Scopes. Next to her is Jim Presley, the co-author of John Scopes' memoirs. And I ruined the picture. John Scopes was born on August 3rd, 1900. This is the first family photo with John Scopes in it. This is John. His mother was Mary Alva. This was taken when he was about a little less than 1 year old. This is his mother, Mary Alva. She worked hard in the home. This is his father, Thomas. He worked for the railroad and was also a union organizer. He had 4 older sisters. The one of most consequence that we'll talk about later is Leela Scopes. Again, more about her later. One thing even that the local people in Dayton don't know is that John Scopes had an older brother. This was his brother, Charles C. He died at the age of about 10 months. He was buried other side of Tennessee. This was his father, and that was Charles. John Scopes had a pretty typical childhood, as best I could tell. Here he is he was born in Paducah, Kentucky. This is on the back porch of his house there with his mother, and I don't know who the little kid is. Other pictures throughout his youth. There's John with his mother and father. This is Leela. The other 2 sisters had already married and gone off. Here's another picture of him with several relatives. There's John. As he prepared to go into high school, this is how he looked. He took this picture in Salem, Illinois. His family moved to Salem when John was entering the 10th grade. There, he played basketball. He was a good student, and people said he liked to debate just about anything there. His family lived in this house. It's called Battelet House. It was allegedly a stopover for the Underground Railroad for slaves escaping the South. This house was about 2 miles away from the hometown hero of Salem, Illinois, William Jennings Bryan. This is his birthplace there in Salem. Bryan spoke at the high school commencement for John Scopes. It was held at the Salem Methodist Church. 5 weeks after his 18th birthday, John Scopes, one sidelight here, an important one. This is obviously a statue of William Jennings Bryan. This statue was originally erected on the mall in Washington, D.C. It was later moved when they were doing road construction. It laid in a National Park Service lot for about 3 decades, at which point Salem, Illinois petitioned the National Park Service to move the statue to Salem. There was a dedication there in Salem, and John Scopes made a point to try to go to that dedication. As best I can tell, it was one of the very few, if not the only time, John Scopes ever called reporters to tell them that he was going to be somewhere. For a long time, until his final years, he didn't have much to do with reporters, but he was intent on getting to the dedication of this statue. He was living in Shreveport at the time. He got all the way to Paducah to see his family, and he got sick. And he had to cancel. And for the second time, I think, he had to call the reporters again and say he couldn't make it. That story of Scopes being ill and unable to make it to the dedication became, I've seen it in 7 or 8 newspapers. It was almost a national story that he couldn't get to this dedication of Bryan's statue. He had a great deal of admiration for Bryan, as well as Darrow. There, 5 weeks after his 18th birthday, John Scopes signed up for military service, listing his occupation as schoolboy. He was not called into service. A few weeks later, he enrolled at the University of Illinois. He was going to major in chemistry. He did well, but he got sick toward the end of his second semester, went home, he recuperated, and ended up taking several months off that he called, "I was a hobo." He returned to college at the University of Kentucky, where he eventually received in May of 1924 a bachelor's degree in arts and letters. After graduating, he went home to Paducah, lived with his parents again, and was looking for a job. Couldn't find one until late in the summer, thanks to his sister, Leela. Leela later said that she'd filled out the applications for him. He ended up getting 2 offers, according to Leela. One was here in Dayton. The other one, she never mentioned where it was, but the offer in Dayton paid less money, but John Scopes took the deal anyway because he thought it was a smaller school, and he said it wouldn't get into any, quote, hot water. Well, I'm not sure how that worked out for him. Here he was as an undergraduate, near graduation at the University of Kentucky. He took a job here, just a few blocks away, Rhea Central High School, in the fall of 1924. He was late to start the job. He had tonsillitis. And then after the superintendent who hired him, Walter White, got angry at John Scopes, John Scopes reported on the 3rd day of school, Walter White didn't have the paper to allow him to start work. By 5 days after he started his job, he was living in this house. It's just down Market Street. This was his room. Once his trial started, it was easy for the reporters to find him, not just where he lived, but there was no bathroom up here. To use the bathroom, John Scopes had to go outside down a flight of stairs. And once the media were after him, they would just wait for him, coming and going from the bathroom. You could see why he may have tried to avoid them. At high school, he coached football. He also taught physics, a general science class. His football coach, here's the standard picture of him it's John Scopes up in the upper left. Here's a picture and an article I prefer. 2 years before John Scopes became football coach, John Scopes had never participated in organized football. 2 years before he became coach, the coach of the Rhea Central High School team was Wallace Haggard, who became a prosecutor at the Scopes trial. Wallace Haggard had been a football star at Vanderbilt. That's what the newspaper said. In fact, he started one game at Vanderbilt. He was a left guard, I think. But he was, for Dayton's needs, he was a football star from Vanderbilt. He came back here, and the team didn't do too well. They didn't win a game. They didn't score a point. And by the end of the year, they didn't even have a coach. This was a pretty low bar for John Scopes to be joining the football program. The year before John Scopes got to Dayton, another local football star had coached the team to, I think, a 2-8 record. Football was important here, then as now. A 2-8 record, though, John Scopes thought, how bad can we do? His team ended up 4-4-2. At the time, there were no articles describing John Scopes as a great football coach. Once he became a media darling for some organizations, they described him as just that, the best coach in East Tennessee. There'll never be another coach like him here. That's what a 4-4-2 record can do. Relatively great record compared to his predecessors. John Scopes loved coaching. He spent a lot of time at it. He was the first coach in Dayton to let his players smoke cigarettes during the season. He told a couple of reporters when they asked him about his coaching, he said, "I'd much rather coach than talk to bored boys and girls about Mendel's laws of heredity." I'm a biologist, I can appreciate that. One question that followed John Scopes, both before, during, and after the trial, was a very simple one. Did you teach evolution? That was the basis for the law. I'll discuss this more at the very end. But the only direct evidence we have that survives is an exam that John Scopes gave his students in late April. John Scopes was, by that point, the substitute biology teacher. The regular biology teacher was the school principal. His name was Ferguson. Throughout the school year, he had been ill, and in early April, his wife became ill. John Scopes was recruited to teach the biology class there for 3 weeks. Toward the end of his tenure as a substitute biology teacher, he gave an exam. Here's that exam. Teacher J.T. Scopes, biology, dated April 28th. He said later that all he did was review the textbook. If the exam represented what John Scopes taught, then he did not teach evolution. There aren't questions on that exam about evolution. There are questions about the products of evolution. Here's one: insects, flowering plants, a variety of them. But if that's the measure, he did not teach evolution. He was indicted here for violating this Butler law, a ban on teaching human evolution. Here he is standing under a read your Bible sign under a temporary bathroom that was put up on the square. Lots of articles pictured him with women. He dated his students. He dated lots of women in town. Here he is, maybe trying to get away from the reporters. They caught up with him. And articles like this: Scopes is keeping cool. And he doesn't have to swim alone either, you'll note. To get away from some of the attention, he moved back to Paducah to stay with his parents. While he was there, in early June, his sister Leela, who was teaching math in Paducah, was fired because she would not renounce her brother's views about evolution. Here's an article about that. sister of Scopes, denied a position. John and obviously Ann Leela recalled that. A few days before the trial, John Scopes came back to Dayton for what he called the civic event of the century in Dayton, even exceeding this one. I can show you some people here. This is John Scopes right here. That's George Rappier, one of the instigators of the trial. That's John Neal, who was Scopes' chief counsel. Directly across the table at this banquet was William Jennings Bryan. Some other people in the trial you might have heard of. This is Sue Hicks. This is Ben McKenzie. This is Herbert Hicks. This is Richard Rogers, in whose house Bryan stayed and died. And Effie Robinson, the hustling druggist from the store. I'm not going to say much about the trial. People here in Dayton have let me know many times over the years, we don't want to hear the same old thing. I'll suffice it to say, he was convicted. The trial is much better known for the trial itself than the decision. Most people don't know the decision. He was convicted. Here's one of his attorneys, Clarence Darrow, talking to the Journey. Here Scopes is getting the bad news of his conviction. His future hometown, Shreveport, Louisiana, reported his conviction this way, big war-type font. After the trial, some of the journalists started raising money so Scopes could return to school. They raised a little bit here. Most of the money came from scientists. Their goal was to raise $5,000. They were very confident. They said, we may double that. In fact, they raised $2,550. John Scopes was still grateful for that. He went to the University of Chicago, where he enrolled and majored in geology. He was an honor student, but as he had feared, he ran out of money. He started applying for jobs, teaching jobs. John Scopes wanted to be a teacher. He didn't get one. He never had a second chance with teaching. Finally, needing money, he took a job in Venezuela at a lake there called Lake Maracaibo. This is where Venezuela's oil production started to skyrocket. They still pump oil from around this lake. He was described as friendly, hardworking. He fit in very well. Here's another picture of him. Hardly doesn't quite look like the innocent, persecuted teacher out working in Venezuela. His friends, he was very popular there. Here's a birthday party when he turned 29. His friends throwing a pretty nice party for him. At one point, he got sick. He returned to the United States, took his father to Europe. His father had been born there. And then returned. He came home and applied for a few jobs, teaching jobs, still couldn't get a job, and so he returned to Venezuela. There, he met this woman, Mildred Elizabeth Walker, who came from an exceedingly wealthy family. When I was talking with Bill Scopes, he showed me, his widow showed me some of Mildred Walker Scopes' diary, talking about private schools, private tutors, private coaches, symphonies, massages. Her father had made a fortune helping dredge the Panama Canal. He had moved much of his operations to Venezuela, where he lost most of his fortune. The equipment that worked well in Panama began to rust out, according to one account. John and Mildred married on February 3rd, 1930. This is them on their honeymoon on Lake Maracaibo. When about 2 weeks later, when word of John Scopes' marriage got back to the United States, I love this headline. quits evolution. He and Mildred returned to the United States. John applied for a few jobs, didn't think he'd get any teaching. He didn't. And so using money he had saved from his work in Venezuela, he re-enrolled at the University of Chicago. After again re-enrolling, he again ran out of money. And he left there. John Scopes never earned a graduate degree. He and Mildred went back to Paducah. He couldn't find a job. He became very frustrated. Reporters, they weren't as bad as they had been earlier, but they still tracked him. I think jokingly, he told some of the reporters he was a farmer. This was his farming. He mowed the grass a lot. His relatives said, realizing he couldn't get a job, he decided, well, if I can't get a real job, I think I'll be a politician. He ran for office, ran for the U.S. Congress as a congressman at large in Kentucky. He ran on the Socialist Party. His platform was basically the government should control just about everything. He didn't have to stay up late on election night. He got 0.3% of the vote. He never claimed that the election was stolen from him. Voter fraud. This was not a nail biter on election night. He later explained the results by saying that, well, the people who voted for me were my relatives in McCracken County, where Paducah was. Despite his self-deprecating answer to this was a low point in John Scopes' life. He and his wife Mildred stayed in Paducah with John's parents. By this time, John was applying for lots of different jobs, including geology. He kept applying for teaching jobs, but geology as well. It was a low point in his life, telling at least two reporters when they would ask him, "What are you going to do?" "I have no plans. I once did, but I've learned the futility of such plans." In 1933, after living with his parents for more than a year and a half, he got a job as an oil scout in Texas. I'm not sure he liked the job, but he didn't want to be unemployed. He went to work, made the best of it. His family members said he worked 60 hours a week. Did a very good job, got promoted. He eventually ended up in Shreveport when Union Oil eventually transferred their company there. This must have been this is one of the few articles, if not the only one, I ever saw in which John Scopes is mentioned in a newspaper article, and there's nothing about monkeys, a trial, the famed defendant, Darrow or Bryan. It was reported as professional geologists. John Scopes must have liked that. He and Mildred started a family. This is John Jr. You met him earlier. He was born in 1932. 4 years later, Bill Scopes was born. Here is John Jr., and Bill in John's arm. In Shreveport, John Scopes was remarkably active in the St. John's Catholic Church. He was an elder in the church. It wasn't that he just went to church to please his wife. He was an elder in the church. He led prayer meetings. He mentored students. Meanwhile, as his brothers grew up, they opened a restaurant in Chattanooga called the Cajun Connection. I don't know if anybody, probably not, this was in the 1990s. It was open less than a year He said they didn't know what they were doing. John Jr. said we didn't know what we were doing. Our food cost twice as much and it was half as good. It was on Market Street. But there they are. Here's John Scopes taking part in or leading an all-night prayer service in the church. The Shreveport Journal printed this every year with who was in charge. The 7 years I looked, John Scopes was involved in this every year. He was very active in the church. Meanwhile, the boys were in school, and John Scopes had to sign up for the draft again. He was not a schoolboy anymore. He was living in Shreveport. He again was not called into service. Neither of his sons ever studied evolution. I asked both of them, why didn't you? And they, to paraphrase, why should we have? Our father never talked to us about this. When they asked him questions, he answered them, but he never volunteered information. Both of the boys learned about the Scopes trial in college. John Scopes loved coaching when he was in Dayton. Both boys were very active in sports, playing Little League or lots of organized sports year-round. John Scopes never coached them. Meanwhile, there were problems at home. And the problems stemmed from alcohol. I think John Jr. summed it up best, describing his father as a happy drunk and his mother as an angry drunk. I never found any of his relatives that used John Scopes' name with the word alcoholic. They all said he drank a lot. Jim Presley, when he met John Scopes at a party at 2 a.m. in Shreveport. Jim Presley was a Cub reporter, met him at 2 a.m. And when they were doing publicity tours for the book, Jim said, John and I had this little skit we did. Inevitably, someone would ask, how did y'all meet? And Jim Presley would say, we met at a social endeavor, some silly language like social endeavor, at which point John Scopes would interrupt and say, what he's trying to say is we were drunk at a party. I found no indication that John Scopes' drinking ever caused any problem. Like I said, he was promoted at work, well respected, but Mildred had problems with this. Here is one of her arrests. Here. It was very difficult for both boys growing up. Their mother would get violent. In 1947, both boys left to live with their Aunt Leela in Winnetka, Illinois. As John Jr. said, my parents pawned us off on my father's sister. I was driving around Lafayette, Louisiana with John Jr. He was showing me the area and talking about this. And I assumed, you mean like 2 weeks in the summer? You and Bill were there? And he said, no, we lived there 3 years. You went to school there? Yes. My first response was, this couldn't have been good. I was very wrong. John Jr. later went on to tell me these were the best years of their life. John Jr. invited me to a Scopes family reunion. I went to see John Jr. 4 times, and he slowly began to trust me, I guess. The schedule would be I'd get there on a Friday evening. We'd spend most of Saturday together, and then I would see him for breakfast on Sunday, and I would leave. On the third visit, He had just let me off on Sunday, and this was about noon, and he called my hotel room and said, "Would you like to come to a family reunion?" Yeah, I would. He picked me up, and it was an outdoor reunion at his daughter's house. His daughter's Meg. She is a teaching tennis professional in Lafayette at a country club. And toward the end of the evening, we ended up around the kitchen table. And John Jr. started talking about, and his children, they had known Leela. They called her Aunt Leela V. All of them called her Aunt Leela V. Talking about Leela. And the conversation started with John Jr. saying, when we would be in Paducah, Leela would drive like a bat out of hell. The Scopes home was out of town on this road they call Burger Road, very hilly and straight. And Leela liked to drive fast, and John Jr. said, we loved it, but we were scared to death driving around. The conversation slowly changed, though, and John started talking about the importance of Leela, his aunt. He had told me about some of the mistreatment, I guess. Bill told me a whole lot about the mistreatment. And John and Bill, when I followed up with him, Leela saved us. I don't know where I'd be without Leela V. When I asked them, did you ever want to go home? No. Did you miss your parents? No. Did you see your parents? And Bill said, I saw my father one Christmas during those 3 years. Toward the end, John Jr. was sitting there and looked up with tears coming down his face. Leela Scopes was the greatest person I've ever known. It was a silver lining to some really bad stories about their childhood. In 1953, John and Mildred divorced. They stayed in touch with each other. They stayed in touch with each other. Leela moved away. When you look at the property records, you see the separation about 2 miles away. A couple years later, they remarried. By this time, I think Mildred had controlled some of the demons. They lived together through the rest of John Scopes' life. Meanwhile, lots of people wanted John Scopes to come back to Dayton, make presentations at Dayton. At the 10-year anniversary, Dayton had planned a celebration. It was going to be headed by Ben McKenzie. And they finally reached John Scopes, and he said, I don't know anything about it. I ain't going to go. Whatever they're doing. At the last minute, they canceled it. He came back to Dayton a few times. He never told anyone he was coming. Another favorite article of mine, one time when they found him here, this was the entire article. He didn't want to say anything about evolution or the trial, but he did smile. A 2-sentence article reporting we saw John Scopes, and he smiled. In 1960, John Scopes jumped at the chance to come back to Dayton. On July 21st, Scopes Trial Day, there was a parade. I don't think this was the civic event of the century, maybe the second or third one. Here's a picture of John Scopes by the plaque down by the courthouse. Even for the locals, this is the third version of that plaque. This one has a mistake. There was no law about this. He was not tried for expounding the theory of the simian descent of man. They replaced that with another inaccurate plaque. The one that's up there now is accurate. This was John Scopes. He pointed out that this was inaccurate. They didn't change it for a couple of decades. It's a picture of John Scopes in the courtroom. visiting with Sue Hicks. This was a journalist. There's John, the original judge's bench. This is Wallace Haggard, the not-so-successful Dayton football coach, and another journalist. The highlight of the weekend, or the highlight of the day, was the North American premiere of Inherit the Wind out at a drive-in. It's where Bo's Wrecking Service is now. It was by invitation only at a drive-in. This was the ticket. Let in one car. Your job was to climb in the trunk if you wanted to go. John Scopes stood on the roof of the concession stand and said a few things. John Scopes said he enjoyed the movie. He almost had to say that. They were paying him by now. Earlier in his career, he said he had too much respect for the issues to try to cash in. By this time, he was doing everything he could to cash in. He made a great deal of money in the last 5 to 6 years of his life with public appearances. More about that in a minute. There's the movie. John Scopes said he liked it. It lost money, but it remains, as Professor Larson had mentioned it, many people somehow mistook it for a documentary. It's far from accurate, but certainly influential. John Scopes then began traveling to promote the movie. Whoop. Here he is in Los Angeles with the producer and director of Inherit the Wind, Stanley Kramer, pointing to Dayton. Here was an appearance here in Dayton by the courthouse. Here's an appearance in New York City at the American Museum of Natural History. During Scopes' trial day, he addressed a big crowd from the courthouse. For all of his life, John Scopes spoke highly of the people of Dayton. He said, we had disagreements, but I love them, they love me. He was given a key to the city. There's John and Mildred. This was the mayor, J.J. Rogers. And that key to the city represented the freedom of the city of Dayton, Tennessee. As John Scopes entered the final 5 or 6 years of his life, he had I was hoping Nancy Shipley would be here. It must have been a highlight for John Scopes. During Scopes' trial day, he got to meet Miss Dayton. If you're a Dayton resident, this was Nancy Shipley. She lives just down on Market Street. If you see her, tell her I tried my best to embarrass her here. This was Miss Dayton. This was the picture in the newspaper. Here's a little better picture of it. Here is Sarah Jane Locke. Sarah Jane here. Tell her that I tried to embarrass her too. At home, John Scopes had 3 hobbies in the last few years of his life: drinking, reading. Both of his sons talked about how he would check out stacks of books, read them. Here he is taking some back. And fishing. Here's with a day's catch. Mildred also liked to fish. They lived right on a lake called Moss Lake. Contrary to some accounts, John Scopes was not a recluse. In the final 5 years of his life, he did everything he could to generate publicity. He didn't hide from the press. The press knew where he lived. This is his wife, Mildred. Here's his mailbox. His name is clearly visible. He had a listed phone number. He got lots of calls, and both boys said he answered them all. But the most common things John said was, I don't want to talk about that. Thank you for calling. And he would hang up. He often complained. In his later years, people would write him asking for his autograph. And he complained that they're too cheap. These people making this request, they're too cheap to even enclose a stamp. So he threw away most of them. He got one type of request that Bill told me he always answered. And it was this envelope. In 1957, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp honoring the Teachers of America with a first day of issue envelope. When John Scopes got that, he was even willing to pay the postage to send his autograph. Here is one of those envelopes. If you want to see an original of it, you can go to the county historian's office, Miss Pat Guffey, over here. I think she has one on her desk. In 1965, John Scopes met a cub reporter named Jim Presley. They struck it off. Close friends. They, 2 years later, produced this book, Center of the Storm. They became strong friends. Jim Presley ended up being a pallbearer for John Scopes. This is Jim Presley a couple months ago. This is how John Scopes inscribed a book to Jim Presley. Fran is Jim's wife. John is Jim and Fran's son. May I always be permitted to be your friend. Meanwhile, John Scopes was accepting any invitation to speak, promote his book. Here he was at some local places, colleges, he spoke at churches, anywhere he could. He went on national tours. Here he is in Los Angeles on a show called To Tell the Truth. You can Google this, John Scopes, To Tell the Truth, and you can watch the entire segment online. He was joined, this person's real name was Charles Darrow, and the middle person was William Jennings Bryan. He gave speeches, several in New York City, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, Los Angeles, Phoenix. He would go wherever he could to promote the book. Here he is in Canada. He spoke at, I think, 4 television shows. This one in Montreal. In 1968, John Scopes met someone that I introduced earlier in the picture, Susan Epperson. Susan Epperson was a first-year teacher in Little Rock, Arkansas. Arkansas had a law very similar to the Butler Law here in Tennessee, banning the teaching of human evolution. Susan Epperson, in a remarkably courageous stand, challenged that law. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court struck down that law, and by implication, all laws banning the teaching of human evolution. A few weeks later, about 6 weeks after this decision, Susan Epperson met John Scopes in Shreveport in a bar at a Holiday Inn. They are holding a book by Jerry Tompkins, I introduced earlier, D-Days at Dayton. When I had not met Susan Epperson, when I met her, she was hesitant to meet me. She didn't know if I was going to, try to save her. She was skeptical of people in those days, of their motives. We had a mutual friend. We met at a neutral site. And she walked up to me and handed me this picture, and I didn't quite, at first glance, I didn't recognize it. And she said, "That's me and John Scopes." My mouth must have opened. We talked for a second, and I asked, what did y'all talk about? And Susan Epperson is royalty in science education. What did you talk about? She said, well, we talked about our families, our friends, the weather. She said, pretty standard stuff, our cases. So what do you remember most? To which Susan Epperson said, John Scopes said he was still getting an average of 1 letter per day about his trial. This was 43 years later. People still wanted to know about John Scopes and the Scopes trial. This made some newspapers. Jerry Tompkins summarized it very well. What John Scopes started in 1925, Susan Epperson was able to finish. By now, John Scopes was in his late 60s, and his health was declining, no doubt due or certainly correlated with his heavy smoking. You've seen pictures of him, an omnipresent cigarette. All of his 4 sisters lived well into their 90s. John Scopes died at the age of 70. He made his last public appearance in Nashville on April 1st, 1970. I don't know if that date was chosen for April Fool's Day. He gave a lecture at Peabody Teachers College, which is now a part of Vanderbilt. This was his last public appearance. Here he is with a full house wanting to hear about him. Time magazine said he returned to the classroom a conquering hero. By now, his health was increasingly bad. This was in April 1970. He went home from Nashville thinking he had a gallbladder infection. The traditional treatments at the time for a gallbladder infection had no effect. His health continued to decline, and he had finally had exploratory surgery in early June of 1970, and they found his body cavity full of cancer. They sewed him back up. He spent most of the rest of his life at home taking pain pills. There are 3 questions that followed John Scopes. Certainly, every interview that he gave, everywhere he went, these are the 3 questions that every article either mentioned that John Scopes had a comment, or the article said he didn't want to talk about it. The first one, did you teach evolution in Dayton? I talked about the exam, suggesting he did not. His responses to this changed over the years. In his memoir, that most people cite for his opinion, he in effect says, I don't remember, I don't think I did. He's rather non-committal about it. That became the standard line. When you watch interviews over the decades, his responses varied. I don't know why they varied. It may have been he was frustrated with an aggressive reporter. Maybe he was having a good day or a bad day, but sometimes he said, no, I did not. Other times he said, I don't remember. And sometimes, several different times, he said, well, if I taught biology for 3 weeks, I must have. So we still don't have a definitive answer to that. What did your trial accomplish? In his memoirs, he says that you have to take a stand on basic issues. Everybody has to do their part. I don't doubt that he meant that. Other times, though, he said, I don't know what it accomplished. And even other times he said, I don't think it accomplished much at all. It was a waste of time. Again, perhaps he was having a bad day or something. The last one, he was asked every television appearance, every radio, would you do it again? And every time he said, yes. It caused him trouble. He couldn't get a job as a teacher. That's what he wanted to do. He gave that up. But despite that, he said he would do it again. John Scopes died on October 21st, 1970. This is the last picture of John Scopes in his kitchen. That's John. That's Mildred. This is Bill Scopes' wife, Jackie Scopes, and this is Jackie and Bill's daughter. That is John and Mildred's granddaughter. He died soon after this. There was a service in in Shreveport at St. John's Catholic Church, after which John was taken to Paducah. He was buried by his parents. There's his parents' gravestone. Mildred died 20 years later. When John Scopes was buried, this inscription was not there, a man of courage. That was added about 2 years later by Leela Scopes. who, when she died, was buried right beside John. There used to be a variety of markers for John Scope's grave. There's a plaque outside the cemetery there in Paducah. But according to one person who worked there, there was a large cement name, I don't know what I call it, a large rectangle of concrete with Scopes for this family burial, and the two of them were stolen. That marker is no longer there. That is the grave of John Scopes in Paducah, Kentucky. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have about John Scopes. Yes.
Well, you know how at the end of President Grant, he was reluctant to release his memoirs when he did. It sounds like that was Scopes' story. Why do you think he was motivated in those last few years to be more public about this?
Well, I wouldn't call him, he made money from this. He had a rigorous schedule for promoting both Inherit the Wind and his memoirs. His memoirs don't mention his divorce. As Jim Presley said, these are memoirs, not a biography. He barely mentions his wife. He barely mentions either of his sons. After I learned about their childhood, I had a suspicion of why. His memoirs are certainly incomplete. Some of the things, it sounds like heresy, I couldn't confirm in them. He was paid well for it. Jim Presley said that Jim Presley wrote the book. John Scopes read most of it before it went to press. Jim said he wrote it. He said when they would meet, John had no information to tell Jim. Every time they met, Jim would ask questions, but John never volunteered information about it. I don't doubt that John Scopes wanted to try to set the record straight. It remains, all memoirs are necessarily incomplete. He made some money on it, and I'm sure that's the story he wanted told. Yes.
You said the wife outlived him.
Yes, 20 years.
Did you get to talk with her much?
No, I did not. I became interested in this in 1998, and she died in 1990. Yes?
Do you think that John Scopes first originally in 1925 agreed to be the focus of the trial? Was his motivation to primarily to spread out the Butler Law and science, or was his main motivation to stop Dayton economically?
I think he believed in the cause, certainly did that. But when he was summoned to the Robinson's drugstore, the president of the school board was asking him. This is the person who signed his checks. He believed in it, but it was such a short meeting. Yeah, I'll do it. He had no idea it would turn into what it did turn into.
Was he aware that he used mainly as a way to boost the town economically? It must have been something.
He finally did, even before his trial, but he said, that's fine. He believed in that cause. Let people think for themselves, etc. Yes? I'm sorry? He was fined $100. He said he'd never pay it. His conviction was, and as best I can tell, he didn't. His conviction was overturned a year and a half later. But the law was upheld, so you ended up with kind of nothing. No legal precedent, no conviction. Since there was no conviction, there was no route to the Supreme Court that Darrow had hoped for, and so it ended with nothing. All of that fuss, and they end with where they started. A lot of publicity. Mr. Robinson sold a lot of ice cream and lemonade, but no legal precedent. Yes.
How do you explain Leela in the sense that she takes the kids from a bad situation on one hand, and the kids really look up to her, but here she has the tombstone changed to being a person she's very against.
She greatly respected John. She greatly respected her brother.
Even amidst all this family trouble.
Yes. Yes. I'm sure she may have had some questions in those 3 years. When the boys, after 3 years, went back to live with their parents, they didn't want to go. The last, Bill and John both said when they were getting in the car to leave, the last thing that Leela told John Jr. was, look out for your brother. Look out for your younger brother. I'm sure they had questions about what the boys were going back to, but Leela greatly respected her brother taking a stand. Leela was much like him.
I was just curious, did he publicly comment on the Supreme Court Epperson case and then the overturning of the other acts?
Barely. He's comments like it's about time. He said that many newspapers offered to pay John Scopes way to the two earlier trials in Susan Epperson's case, her trial and that appeal to the Arkansas Supreme Court. Newspapers wanted to get him to show up. That would have been Scopes 2, all of that stuff. He refused them all because he said he didn't want to take the attention away from Susan Epperson. He later said, it's about time. I followed your case the whole time. I was pulling for you. But that's about all he said. Yes.
It seems odd that he was really a geology teacher, right? And that he couldn't go somewhere in the country where he could teach geology.
He never taught geology. He studied it. He studied it and became a professional geologist, but he never taught geology. He wanted to be a teacher, though. I'm done. If they're done, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you. That's fine. Please.
That's our program. Thank you all. I hope to see many of you tomorrow. I would like Kayla to come up here and our speakers that are here, I think. Everybody but Mr. Summers is here. We have a little something for you. You are welcome to welcome this, but to watch this, but thank you, and we so appreciate you coming and celebrating with us the Centennial Scopes Trial.
Thank you for not revolting and throwing me out.